Before ideas of liberty, reason, and progress began reshaping France, the country stood under the weight of the ancien regime, a political and social order rooted in centuries of tradition. By the early 18th century, France was one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, but it was also deeply unequal, rigidly hierarchical, and resistant to change. Understanding the Enlightenment requires first understanding what it was reacting against. The ancien regime, or Old Order, described the structure of French society prior to the Revolution of 1789. At its core was absolute monarchy, where the king ruled by divine right and was subject to no earthly authority. France was not governed by a constitution, nor constrained by a separation of powers. Instead, power radiated outward from the monarch, who was both head of state and source of law. The will of the king was law, and questioning it was often considered treasonous. This system had been consolidated under King Louis XIV, who reigned from 1643 until 1715. Known as the Sun King, Louis XIV famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state." His reign marked the height of absolutism in France. Through control of the nobility, expansion of royal bureaucracy, and construction of the lavish palace at Versailles, Louis centralized power like no French king before him. The nobility were brought under his watchful eye and transformed from independent power holders into courtiers dependent on royal favor. After his death, the throne passed to his great-grandson, Louis XV, who reigned from 1715 to 1774. Though less authoritarian in style than his predecessor, Louis XV inherited an inflexible system. By the time of his rule, many of the structural problems of the ancien regime were already deeply rooted. French society under this regime was officially divided into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, bishops, abbots, and parish priests who represented the Catholic Church. The Church held immense influence, not only spiritually, but economically and politically. It owned large portions of land and collected tithes from the population. It was exempt from many taxes, and its leaders often came from noble families. The second estate was the nobility. These were the aristocrats who held traditional privileges, including exemption from many taxes and access to high offices in the military, the church, and the royal court. Some were extremely wealthy, others, particularly those in the provinces, were not. But all shared a legal and social status that set them above the majority of the population. The third estate included everyone else, from wealthy merchants and lawyers to urban laborers and rural peasants. This group made up more than 95% of the population. They paid the vast majority of taxes and had little to no political representation. Even prosperous members of the bourgeoisie, the educated middle class, found themselves excluded from power. In rural areas, many peasants still owed feudal dues to local lords. Life for much of the Third Estate was marked by hard labor, rising costs of living, and a sense of injustice. Economically, France was a land of contradiction. It had the largest population in Europe, around 26 million people by the mid-18th century, and it was rich in agricultural output. French ports carried goods across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. Its artisans were renowned for luxury products such as textiles, porcelain, and furniture. Yet its economy remained largely feudal and heavily taxed. Internal tariffs made trade between regions expensive, and the tax system was deeply inefficient. One major problem was that taxation fell disproportionately on those least able to pay. The clergy and nobility were largely exempt, while the Third Estate bore the burden. Even within that class, exemptions and loopholes allowed some to avoid paying. Tax collection itself was often outsourced to private individuals known as tax farmers, who were paid a percentage of what they collected. This encouraged corruption and abuse. In short, the system not only failed to provide adequate revenue for the state, it also generated resentment among those who paid the most. France's government was similarly burdened by fragmentation. Despite the image of centralized monarchy, different regions of France followed different legal systems. Some areas were governed by Roman law traditions. Others followed local customary laws. There were overlapping jurisdictions, multiple courts, and a tangle of privileges. The king could issue decrees, but enforcement often depended on regional parliaments. high courts that could register or refuse royal edicts. These bodies, dominated by nobles, sometimes acted as brakes on reform, even while claiming to defend liberty. Religion was another central pillar of the ancien regime. The Catholic Church was the official religion of the state, and religious unity was considered essential for national stability. Protestants, who had once held significant numbers in France, had been largely suppressed after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This revocation, carried out by Louis XIV, outlawed Protestantism and forced thousands of Huguenots to flee the country. Although some remained, they faced legal and social discrimination. Religious dissent was not tolerated, and heresy could still be punished by imprisonment or worse. Censorship was widespread. Books, plays, and pamphlets were subject to approval by royal or religious authorities. Licenses were required for publication, and printers could be punished for publishing unauthorized materials. Still, ideas circulated, sometimes legally, often secretly. The growing number of literate people, especially in cities, created a market for books and pamphlets. Coffee houses and salons became places where ideas were exchanged, even if cautiously. Despite this rigid structure, cracks were appearing by the early 1700s. France had been engaged in a series of costly wars throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. The War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, and others drained the royal treasury and increased the national debt. Financial crises became more frequent. When the government tried to raise taxes or reform the tax system, it often met resistance from privileged classes. Reforms were proposed, debated, and shelved. The state remained powerful but increasingly brittle. Meanwhile, a new class was emerging. The bourgeoisie, urban professionals, merchants, and intellectuals began to seek greater influence. They were educated, often wealthy, and aware of ideas circulating beyond France's borders. Many admired developments in Britain, where Parliament limited the power of the monarch, and where a free press and vibrant intellectual culture flourished. The success of the scientific revolution had shown that reason and observation could explain the natural world. Could those same tools be used to improve society? As the rigid structures of the ancien regime held firm in France, winds of change were beginning to stir from other directions. These changes were not political at first, nor were they revolutionary in the modern sense. They began in the world of ideas, sparked by a renewed interest in human inquiry and a growing confidence in the power of reason. Long before the French Enlightenment fully took shape, its intellectual foundations were laid during the scientific revolution and through the rediscovery of humanism, two movements that redefined how Europeans understood themselves and the universe around them. The scientific revolution, which unfolded gradually between the late 15th and early 18th centuries, transformed the European view of nature and knowledge. At its heart was a shift from accepting received wisdom to relying on direct observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. For centuries, European science had been dominated by the teachings of ancient authorities like Aristotle and Ptolemy, often filtered through medieval Christian doctrine. The cosmos was seen as hierarchical and unchanging, with Earth at its center and heaven beyond the stars. But these assumptions would be challenged by a series of groundbreaking thinkers. One of the earliest figures to initiate this transformation was Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer whose work on the revolutions of the celestial spheres was published in the year 1543. Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, placing the sun, not the Earth, at its center. Though radical, his theory was largely ignored at first. It gained momentum when later scientists built upon his ideas using mathematics, instruments, and rigorous observation. Galileo Galilei, an Italian physicist and astronomer, made key contributions in the early 17th century. Using a telescope, he refined himself. Galileo observed moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, and imperfections on the moon, evidence that directly contradicted the geocentric model endorsed by church doctrine. His support for the Copernican system brought him into conflict with the Catholic Church. and in 1633 he was tried by the Roman Inquisition and placed under house arrest. Yet his work spread across Europe and stirred debate among scholars. It was in this same era that Johannes Kepler formulated the laws of planetary motion, and Francis Bacon advocated for a new scientific method based on inductive reasoning. But perhaps the most influential figure was Isaac Newton. In the year 1687, Newton published his Principia Mathematica, a monumental work that laid out the laws of motion and universal gravitation. Newton's mathematics revealed a universe governed by predictable, measurable laws, not mystical forces or arbitrary divine will. For many intellectuals, this was a revelation. These scientific discoveries held more than just technical importance. They implied that human beings could, through reason and empirical investigation, uncover the principles that governed reality. If the natural world operated according to understandable laws, why not society, politics, or morality? The success of the scientific revolution encouraged thinkers to apply rational methods to every area of life. This growing confidence in human intellect became a cornerstone of Enlightenment thought. While the scientific revolution transformed understanding of the natural world, humanism focused on the individual and the study of human culture. Emerging from the Renaissance in Italy and gradually spreading throughout Europe, humanism emphasized the study of classical texts, the dignity of human beings, and the potential for individual development. Humanist scholars rejected the purely theological concerns of the medieval period and instead turned to ancient Greek and Roman sources for inspiration in philosophy, art, literature, and ethics. By the 17th century, this revival of classical learning had taken root in French intellectual circles. Universities, though still conservative in many respects, began to expose students to a wider range of texts and ideas. Translations of works by Cicero, Plato, and Seneca became widely available. Humanism encouraged critical thinking, linguistic skill, and historical awareness, all qualities that would later define Enlightenment discourse. The combined influence of scientific inquiry and humanist scholarship began to create a new worldview. In this vision, knowledge was not the exclusive domain of tradition or the church, but something that could be expanded, tested, and revised through reasoned debate. Human beings were not merely subjects in a cosmic hierarchy, but rational agents capable of shaping their environment and questioning authority. France, in particular, became fertile ground for these new ideas. Though the Catholic Church maintained strong influence and censorship remained strict, a growing number of intellectuals began to challenge orthodox views. Many of these early thinkers did not yet identify themselves as part of an Enlightenment, but their writings and discussions laid the intellectual groundwork for those who would come after them. One of the most important French figures to emerge during this transitional period was René Descartes. Born in 1596, Descartes was a philosopher, mathematician, and scientist whose work exemplified the shift toward rationalism. In his famous philosophical work, Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes sought to establish a foundation of certainty by doubting everything that could possibly be doubted. From this methodical skepticism, he arrived at his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, the mind was the source of certainty, and reason was the path to truth. He rejected blind acceptance of authority, whether religious or scholarly, and instead argued that individuals must use their own rational faculties to arrive at knowledge. Descartes' emphasis on clear thinking, deduction, and the role of the individual would deeply influence French Enlightenment thinkers. Though he remained a devout Catholic, his method challenged traditional dogmas and encouraged others to do the same. This intellectual transformation did not occur in isolation. European thinkers were increasingly aware of developments beyond their own borders. The rise of constitutional monarchy in England after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the growth of commercial societies in the Dutch Republic, and the expansion of global trade all contributed to new perspectives on government, economics, and human interaction. French travelers, diplomats, and exiles brought back accounts of societies where different systems of governance and religious tolerance were practiced. These comparisons became powerful tools for critique. The rise of the printing press had also made a lasting impact. By the 18th century, books, pamphlets, and journals could reach wider audiences than ever before. In France, censorship laws still restricted what could be published officially, but underground networks of printers and booksellers flourished. Smuggled books from Geneva, Amsterdam, and London introduced readers to radical new ideas. Reading became a social activity, not just a solitary one, and texts were shared, discussed, and debated in homes, cafes, and informal gatherings. In these spaces, the seeds of Enlightenment thinking began to sprout. Educated men, and increasingly women, engaged in discussions about science, religion, politics, and art. Though not yet coordinated into a unified movement, these conversations were the beginning of a new intellectual culture, one that prized inquiry over tradition and debate over obedience. Importantly, these shifts were not purely academic. As economic and political pressures on the ancien regime intensified, the appeal of rational reform grew. Members of the rising bourgeoisie found in these ideas a framework for questioning their exclusion from power. Educated clergy and minor nobles began to explore how church and state could be improved. Even some reform-minded royal officials, frustrated by bureaucratic stagnation, looked to science and reason for solutions. In the early 17th century, France gave rise to a thinker whose influence would reach far beyond his lifetime and deeply shape the intellectual foundations of the Enlightenment. René Descartes, often referred to as the father of modern philosophy, introduced a method of thinking that encouraged individuals to question accepted truths and seek certainty through reason alone. His approach, known as Cartesian doubt, became a cornerstone of Enlightenment rationalism. René Descartes was born in 1596 in La Haye-en-Touraine, a small town in central France. He received a Jesuit education at the Collège Royal Henri le Grand at La Flèche, where he studied classical literature, mathematics, and scholastic philosophy. Though deeply grounded in Catholic tradition, Descartes would come to reject many of the conclusions of scholastic thought, particularly its reliance on authority and Aristotelian metaphysics. In his early adulthood, Descartes pursued a career in the military and traveled extensively across Europe. These years of observation, study, and reflection helped him develop a deep skepticism about the reliability of received knowledge. Descartes came to believe that much of what people accepted as true was based on habit, tradition, or flawed reasoning. He wanted to build a system of knowledge that was certain and indubitable. This desire led to one of his most famous philosophical exercises, published in his work Meditations on First Philosophy in the year 1641. In this book, Descartes began by subjecting all his beliefs to radical doubt. He questioned whether his senses could be trusted, whether his memories were accurate, and whether an all-powerful deceiver might be manipulating his perceptions. By doubting everything, he hoped to discover what, if anything, could be known with absolute certainty. The conclusion he reached is one of the most well-known phrases in Western philosophy. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This simple statement, Descartes argued, was the one truth he could not doubt. Even if he were being deceived about everything else, the fact that he was thinking proved his existence. From this foundation, Descartes sought to rebuild knowledge through reason and deduction. What made Descartes' method so revolutionary was not just the content of his conclusions, but the process by which he reached them. He rejected reliance on tradition, custom, or religious authority. Instead, he placed trust in the human mind and its capacity for clear and logical thought. His method, which began with doubt but moved toward certainty through reason, would influence generations of thinkers who followed. Descartes applied this approach beyond philosophy. In mathematics, he developed what became known as Cartesian geometry, uniting algebra and geometry in a single system. This innovation laid the groundwork for the development of calculus and modern mathematical analysis. In the natural sciences, Descartes emphasized mechanical explanations for physical phenomena, arguing that nature operated according to laws that could be discovered and described using reason. In his treatise, Discourse on the Method, published in 1637, Descartes introduced another famous maxim: Je pense, donc je suis, the original French version of I think, therefore I am. In this work, he outlined a four-step method for arriving at truth. Accept only what is clearly known, divide problems into manageable parts, proceed from simple to complex, and review thoroughly. These principles, though modest in appearance, offered a new framework for understanding the world. Descartes' emphasis on method and clarity resonated strongly with Enlightenment thinkers. His rationalism provided a model for how individuals could seek knowledge independently of tradition and dogma. He demonstrated that the mind was capable of uncovering truth through systematic reasoning, a view that would become central to the Enlightenment's belief in human progress. However, Descartes was not without his critics. His dualism, the idea that mind and body are distinct substances, raised difficult questions about how the two interact. Later philosophers such as Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz would challenge and refine his ideas. But even where they disagreed, they worked within a framework that Descartes had helped to establish. The idea that philosophy must be grounded in reason and logic, not inherited authority. In France, Descartes' legacy was complex. His ideas were respected by many intellectuals, but regarded with suspicion by church authorities. The Catholic Church did not take kindly to philosophical systems that appeared to sideline theological explanations. In 1663, Descartes' works were placed on the Index of Forbidden Books by the Roman Catholic Church. Nonetheless, his ideas continued to circulate in educated circles and were studied by those seeking intellectual freedom. It is important to understand that Descartes himself was not an atheist or a political radical. He remained a practicing Catholic throughout his life and believed that his method could ultimately reinforce the truths of religion. He even offered philosophical arguments for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. Yet the tools he developed, skepticism, reason, and individual inquiry, would later be used by others to challenge the very institutions Descartes hoped to support. By the early 18th century, Descartes was revered by many of the philosophes, the thinkers who would shape the French Enlightenment. Though they did not all accept his conclusions, they admired his method. For Voltaire, Descartes represented the beginning of modern thought. Diderot included Descartes among the major figures in the Encyclopedie, recognizing his contribution to freeing philosophy from scholastic constraints. Descartes' approach also influenced educational reforms in France. Schools and academies began to place greater emphasis on mathematics, logic, and empirical investigation. Scientific societies adopted more systematic methods of inquiry, inspired by Cartesian discipline. The Académie des Sciences, founded in 1666 under the patronage of Louis XIV, became a center for rational research, reflecting the growing prestige of reason-based knowledge. Beyond philosophy and science, Descartes' method had broader cultural implications. In placing reason at the center of inquiry, he challenged the legitimacy of inherited hierarchies. If truth could be reached by any thinking individual, then knowledge was not the exclusive domain of the clergy or nobility. This idea, that all people possess the capacity to reason, became a foundational belief of Enlightenment humanism and would eventually feed into calls for political and social reform. Descartes died in 1650 in Stockholm, having been invited to the court of Queen Christina of Sweden. Though his life ended far from France, his ideas returned to shape the intellectual life of his homeland. In the decades after his death, his writings continued to influence debates over philosophy, science, and education. By the time the Enlightenment was fully underway, Descartes' influence could be felt in nearly every corner of French intellectual life. Through his method of doubt, his confidence in human reason, and his call for clarity and precision in thought, René Descartes provided a powerful model for Enlightenment thinkers. He did not seek to overthrow society or religion, but he offered a new way to think, one that would inspire others to question, explore, and imagine alternatives to the world they had inherited. By the early decades of the 18th century, France was alive with intellectual energy. The methods and ideals laid down by earlier thinkers like René Descartes had opened the doors for a generation of writers, scientists, and philosophers who would become known collectively as the philosophes. These men, and occasionally women, were not university professors or theologians. They were public intellectuals, writing in clear language for an educated but non-specialist audience. Their ideas would shape not only the French Enlightenment, but also the modern world. The term philosophe in 18th century France did not mean the same as the English word philosopher. A philosophe was someone who applied reason and critical thought to all areas of life: politics, religion, economics, education, and social organization. They were not confined to abstract theory. They wanted to improve the human condition. The philosophes believed in progress, human dignity, and the capacity of reason to transform society. They challenged traditional authorities and exposed superstition, intolerance, and injustice wherever they found them. This intellectual movement began to take clearer shape in the first half of the 18th century, especially during the reign of Louis XV. France was still a deeply hierarchical society ruled by an absolute monarch, but it was also home to an expanding class of literate citizens hungry for new ideas. The growth of urban centers, the development of the printing press, and the spread of salons and literary societies created fertile ground for the exchange of Enlightenment thought. Among the earliest and most influential philosophes was Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu. Though his major works will be examined more fully in a later section, it is important to note here that Montesquieu helped define the political ambitions of the Enlightenment. In 1721, he inherited the title of Baron and a seat in the Bordeaux Parlement, which gave him first-hand experience with the legal and political structure of France. His early writings critiqued the absurdities of French customs and laws, while his later work explored broader theories of government. But the Enlightenment in France truly gained momentum with the emergence of Voltaire. Born François-Marie Arouet in 1714, Voltaire became a central figure of the Enlightenment because of his wit, sharp criticism of established institutions, and tireless defense of civil liberties. Educated by Jesuits, Voltaire quickly turned against the narrow constraints of religious and political orthodoxy. After spending time in the Bastille for mocking the French aristocracy, he traveled to England, where he encountered a very different intellectual and political culture. In England, Voltaire saw a society where Parliament restrained the power of the monarch, where religious toleration was officially recognized, and where thinkers like John Locke and Isaac Newton were celebrated. These experiences had a profound impact on him. When he returned to France, Voltaire published Letters Concerning the English Nation, also known as Letters on the English. In these essays, he praised English freedoms and rational institutions while implicitly criticizing their French counterparts. The book was immediately banned in France, but widely read and circulated. Voltaire became a relentless critic of religious dogma, censorship, and arbitrary power. He was not anti-religious in the modern sense. He believed in a creator and supported the idea of a rational moral order. But he opposed organized religion when it allied itself with oppression and ignorance. His famous cry, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, was a reference to religious intolerance and superstition. He used satire, irony, and reason to expose the abuses of the church and the failures of the state. His plays, poems, and philosophical tales, such as Candide, brought Enlightenment criticism to a wide public audience. Around the same time, another major voice of the Enlightenment emerged, Denis Diderot. Born in 1713 in eastern France, Diderot was a polymath who would go on to co-edit the Encyclopedie, one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the era. Before that, however, he published essays on literature, science, and philosophy. His early work often dealt with the material world and human nature, reflecting a growing interest in empirical observation and secular ethics. Diderot's contributions to Enlightenment thought were not as flashy as Voltaire's, but they were just as significant. He believed that knowledge should be accessible, practical, and socially useful. He rejected the separation between scholarly knowledge and everyday life. For Diderot, the goal of philosophy was not to retreat into abstraction, but to improve the world. His writings often explored the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility, as well as the challenges of moral decision-making in a complex world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another major philosophe, came from a very different background. Born in Geneva in 1712, Rousseau had little formal education and lived a wandering, often precarious life. Yet he became one of the most original and provocative thinkers of the Enlightenment. While others celebrated civilization and progress, Rousseau questioned whether society had corrupted the natural goodness of humanity. His discourse on the origin and basis of inequality among men, published in 1755, challenged the idea that social hierarchy was natural or necessary. Rousseau's influence would eventually extend to political theory, education, and the arts. His concept of the general will would become central to debates about democracy and collective governance. But even in his early works, Rousseau showed a deep concern with how power and privilege shaped human relationships. He argued that true freedom required not just the absence of oppression, but a society built on mutual respect and moral autonomy. Together, these figures, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and others, helped transform Enlightenment ideas into a movement. They were joined by thinkers such as Claude Adrien Helvétius, who explored human psychology and ethics from a materialist perspective. Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, a mathematician and co-editor of the Encyclopedie, and Étienne Bonneau de Condillac, who developed theories of knowledge based on sensory experience. Though they did not always agree, they shared a commitment to reason, skepticism, and reform. One key characteristic of the philosophes was their engagement with the public. They wrote essays, dialogues, pamphlets, and plays designed to reach educated readers beyond the universities. They contributed to periodicals and corresponded with each other across national boundaries. They participated in salons, where ideas could be exchanged in informal and often spirited conversation. They debated with nobles, clergy, and even monarchs. The Enlightenment was not just an abstract philosophy. It was a cultural movement that engaged directly with society. The philosophes were also interested in practical reform. They addressed issues such as criminal justice, education, economic policy, and the rights of women. While some of their ideas remained conservative by modern standards, their critiques of cruelty, inequality, and irrational tradition laid the groundwork for later social movements. Their influence extended into legal reforms, educational systems, and emerging discussions about human rights. It is important to recognize that the Enlightenment in France was not a single unified movement. The philosophes differed in temperament, background, and emphasis. Some were more religious, others more secular. Some were gradual reformers, others more radical. But what united them was a shared belief in the power of human reason and a desire to use that power to improve the world. In the evolving landscape of French Enlightenment thought, few thinkers had as profound and lasting an impact on political theory as Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu. A nobleman, judge, and political philosopher, Montesquieu is best remembered for his bold and methodical exploration of how governments function and how they ought to function in a just and rational society. His seminal work, De l'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of the Laws, published in the year 1748, would become one of the most influential texts of the Enlightenment, shaping debates not only in France but around the world. Montesquieu was born in 1789 at the Château de la Brède, near Bordeaux, into a well-established noble family. Educated in law and the classics, he inherited his uncle's title and seat in the Bordeaux Parlement, giving him first-hand experience in judicial matters. This role exposed him to the complex and often arbitrary workings of French law under the ancien regime. Unlike some of his fellow philosophes, Montesquieu was not a revolutionary. He did not call for the overthrow of monarchy or a sudden break with tradition. Instead, he sought to understand the principles that made certain forms of government more moderate, stable, and free than others. Montesquieu began his literary career with satire. His early work, Lettres persanes, Persian Letters, published in 1721, took the form of fictional letters written by two Persian travelers observing French society. This device allowed Montesquieu to critique European customs, religious hypocrisy, and despotism through the eyes of outsiders. The book was clever and popular, but it only hinted at the depth of his political thought. Over the next 2 decades, Montesquieu embarked on a massive project to study the laws, institutions, and customs of different societies and to understand what forces shaped them. He read widely in history, economics, law, and geography. He also traveled through Europe, including to Italy, Austria, Hungary, and England, observing how governments operated in practice. His observations culminated in The Spirit of the Laws, a sprawling and ambitious work that would come to define his legacy. In The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu argued that laws are not arbitrary commands from rulers, but products of specific social, cultural, and environmental conditions. He believed that there could be no one-size-fits-all system of government. The best form of government for a given society depended on its geography, economy, religion, climate, and traditions. This view stood in contrast to the rigid universalism often found in earlier political theory. Yet, despite this relativistic foundation, Montesquieu believed that some principles were broadly applicable, particularly the idea that concentrated power tends to produce tyranny. To avoid this danger, he proposed a separation of powers within government. Drawing on his study of the English constitutional system, Montesquieu identified 3 main functions of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. He argued that these powers should be distributed among separate institutions so that no one body or individual could dominate the rest. This theory of the separation of powers became one of the most enduring contributions of Enlightenment political thought. Montesquieu wrote, "When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, there can be no liberty." He believed that liberty was not an absolute right to do anything one pleased, but the ability to live under laws that were fair, stable, and not subject to the whims of a ruler. A balanced constitution, he argued, protected individuals from arbitrary authority by ensuring that each branch of government could check the others. Montesquieu admired the English system, especially after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had limited royal power and strengthened Parliament. However, his understanding of English politics was not always accurate. He believed, for example, that the judiciary in England was more independent than it truly was. Nevertheless, his general point, that political liberty requires institutional checks and balances, was clear and powerful. Unlike more radical Enlightenment figures, Montesquieu did not call for the abolition of monarchy. In fact, he categorized governments into 3 main types: republics, monarchies, and despotisms. Republics were governed by many, monarchies by one according to law, and despotisms by one without law. He believed that virtue was essential in a republic, honor in a monarchy, and fear in a despotism. Each system, in his view, depended on a different psychological foundation. Montesquieu believed that monarchies could function well if they were restrained by law and supported by a noble class that acted as a counterbalance to the king's power. He saw the French nobility not as enemies of liberty, but as potential guardians of it, provided they defended law and custom rather than personal privilege. This stance reflected Montesquieu's own social position, but also showed his cautious approach to reform. He did not envision a democracy of the people, but a constitutional monarchy moderated by tradition and legal authority. His views were not without controversy. The Spirit of the Laws was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books by the Catholic Church in 1751. The Church objected to Montesquieu's critical treatment of religious authority and his suggestion that different religions might be suited to different societies. For example, he argued that Islam might work well in certain climates and cultures, while Christianity had other strengths. He also defended religious tolerance, a theme that resonated with other Enlightenment thinkers. Despite the Church's condemnation, the Spirit of the Laws was widely read and discussed. It circulated in multiple editions and was translated into several languages. It was studied in salons, debated in courts, and consulted by reformers across Europe. In France, it influenced thinkers such as Voltaire and Diderot. even when they disagreed with some of its conclusions. Outside France, Montesquieu's work had perhaps even greater influence. In the American colonies, Montesquieu was one of the most frequently cited political thinkers during the debates leading up to the American Revolution. His theory of separated powers helped shape the structure of the United States Constitution. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, referred to Montesquieu's ideas when arguing for the division of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. In this way, Montesquieu's thought had a tangible impact on the development of modern democratic institutions. In France, however, the road to political reform would be far more turbulent. Montesquieu's cautious call for moderation and constitutional limits did not satisfy all Enlightenment thinkers. Some believed that deeper, more radical change was needed. They admired his analysis, but wanted to push further, beyond monarchy, beyond privilege, and toward a society based on equality and direct participation. Nevertheless, Montesquieu remains essential to the history of the Enlightenment because he provided a systematic framework for understanding power and liberty. He showed that good government was not simply a matter of who ruled, but of how institutions were structured and balanced. His writing encouraged readers to think critically about law, authority, and justice, and to consider how society could be improved without descending into chaos. By the time of his death in 1755, Montesquieu was recognized as a major figure in European intellectual life. His influence would continue to grow, especially as revolutions began to sweep across the Atlantic and then back into Europe. While others would take Enlightenment ideas in more radical directions, Montesquieu had provided the architecture, the conceptual blueprints, for a new kind of politics grounded in rational analysis and the pursuit of liberty. If Montesquieu offered the architecture of Enlightenment political theory, then Voltaire gave it voice, sharp, irreverent, and unrelenting. Where others theorized, Voltaire attacked. Where others hesitated, he provoked. Born François-Marie Arouet in the year 1714, Voltaire became the most celebrated and feared public intellectual of the French Enlightenment. His defense of civil liberties, especially freedom of expression and religious tolerance, made him a hero to some and a dangerous agitator to others. Through plays, essays, letters, pamphlets, and philosophical tales, he helped bring Enlightenment ideas from elite circles into the public arena, challenging the power of kings, priests, and censors. Voltaire's early life was marked by both privilege and tension. Raised in a well-to-do family in Paris, he was educated by Jesuits at the Collège Louis le Grand, where he developed a lifelong respect for literature, Latin, and classical philosophy. However, he also became known for his wit and irreverence, qualities that quickly brought him into conflict with authority. At a young age, he chose the pen name Voltaire, likely an anagram of a Latinized version of his surname, and began writing satires that mocked the ruling elite. This boldness cost him dearly. In 1726, after a dispute with a nobleman, Voltaire was imprisoned in the Bastille. It was not his first time, nor would it be his last. Upon release, he was exiled to England, where he spent nearly 3 years. These years proved transformative. In England, Voltaire was exposed to a society markedly different from absolutist France. There, he saw a constitutional monarchy, an independent judiciary, and a relatively free press. He attended sessions of Parliament, read the works of John Locke, and became an admirer of Isaac Newton's scientific achievements. When Voltaire returned to France, he published Letters on the English Nation, often called Philosophical Letters in French. This series of essays praised English political and intellectual life, highlighting its toleration of dissent, its scientific culture, and its more liberal institutions. Though carefully framed as travel commentary, the work was clearly a critique of French absolutism, clerical power, and censorship. The French authorities banned the book and ordered it publicly burned. Voltaire, once again, was forced into exile, but exile never silenced him. Voltaire continued to write and publish at an extraordinary pace. His works appeared under pseudonyms, through underground presses, and via smuggling networks. He became a master of maneuvering around censorship while maintaining a constant stream of commentary on social and political life. His targets were varied: fanaticism, religious intolerance, judicial cruelty, and arbitrary power. But his method was consistent: irony, logic, and fearless wit. One of his most famous works, Candide, published in 1759, is a short philosophical tale that attacks blind optimism. Through the misadventures of its naive protagonist, Voltaire mocks the idea that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, a philosophy associated with the German thinker Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. The story takes the reader through wars, earthquakes, religious persecution, and human cruelty, ultimately concluding that the best course of action is not to speculate, but to cultivate our garden, to work and improve the world in practical ways. Voltaire was not an original philosopher in the technical sense. He did not produce systematic theories of politics or metaphysics. Instead, he was a synthesizer, popularizer, and polemicist. He used the tools of literature, dialogue, narrative, satire, to make abstract ideas accessible and urgent. His goal was not just to educate, but to provoke reform. He believed that ignorance and superstition were the roots of injustice, and that education and reason were the most powerful weapons against tyranny. A central theme in Voltaire's work was the critique of religious dogma. Though he believed in a supreme being, what he called the supreme architect, he was a lifelong critic of organized religion, particularly the Catholic Church. He saw the Church not as a moral guide, but as a corrupt institution aligned with state power, often complicit in violence and repression. His writings are filled with denunciations of the Inquisition, the persecution of Protestants, and the abuses committed in the name of faith. The most famous example of this stance came in Voltaire's campaign to exonerate Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant from Toulouse who was wrongly accused of murdering his son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. In 1762, Calas was tortured and executed in a gruesome public spectacle. Outraged by this miscarriage of justice, Voltaire launched a relentless public campaign to clear Calas's name. He wrote articles, pamphlets, and letters exposing the prejudice and legal incompetence that had led to the execution. Eventually, the verdict was overturned, and Calas was posthumously exonerated. This campaign was more than a personal crusade. It was a declaration of Enlightenment values. Voltaire turned the case into a symbol of the broader struggle against intolerance, religious fanaticism, and state brutality. It demonstrated how public opinion, mobilized through reasoned argument and media, could challenge institutional injustice. Voltaire would repeat this model in other cases, defending victims of persecution and using each example to press for legal and social reform. Voltaire's reach extended beyond France. He maintained correspondence with major figures across Europe, including Catherine the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia. Though he often criticized monarchs in his writings, he also believed that enlightened rulers could be allies in the pursuit of reform. This belief in enlightened despotism, the idea that a wise and rational monarch could implement Enlightenment ideals, was one of Voltaire's more pragmatic positions. He distrusted mass democracy, fearing it would give rise to mob rule, but he hoped that reasoned governance from above could improve society. Despite his admiration for powerful rulers, Voltaire remained a consistent critic of unchecked authority. He never ceased to challenge censorship and repression. One of his famous remarks captures his stance on freedom of speech. "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Though this quote is often paraphrased and possibly apocryphal, it summarizes Voltaire's central commitment: that liberty depends on the ability to speak, write, and believe freely. His views were not without contradictions. Voltaire was not a democrat in the modern sense, and he sometimes held elitist views. His support for social reform did not always extend to the lower classes. Nonetheless, his relentless advocacy for tolerance, justice, and intellectual freedom helped define the Enlightenment's moral core. Voltaire's influence extended through his writings and personal networks. His works were widely read in salons, coffeehouses, and private libraries. Despite repeated bans, they reached thousands of readers across Europe. His style, accessible, sharp, and direct, made difficult ideas understandable and compelling. Even when readers disagreed with his conclusions, they engaged with his arguments. By the time of his death in 1778, Voltaire had become a symbol of Enlightenment thought. He was welcomed back to Paris in triumph after years of exile, and his plays were performed to packed audiences. When he died, his supporters smuggled his body back into the city and buried him in secret. Years later, during the French Revolution, his remains were moved to the Pantheon, a gesture of national recognition for a man who had once been branded a dangerous subversive. In the vast spectrum of Enlightenment thinkers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau stands apart. His writings were not merely intellectual arguments. They were passionate, provocative, and deeply personal. While others in the Enlightenment emphasized reason, moderation, and reform from above, Rousseau dared to imagine an entirely different kind of society, one built not on privilege or rational calculation, but on moral equality and direct participation. His concept of the social contract, his critique of inequality, and his belief in popular sovereignty would not only influence his contemporaries, but also help shape the political revolutions of the modern world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in Geneva in the year 1712. His early life was marked by instability and hardship. His mother died shortly after his birth, and his father fled the city when Rousseau was still a child. He spent much of his youth wandering, taking various jobs, and receiving little formal education. Yet Rousseau was a voracious reader and a self-taught intellectual. His outsider status gave him a distinct voice, one that was skeptical of elites, distrustful of institutions, and attentive to the lived experience of ordinary people. Rousseau first gained attention in 1750 with his discourse on the sciences and arts, which won a prize from the Academy of Dijon. In this essay, he argued that the progress of knowledge and the arts had not improved morality, but had, in fact, corrupted it. This was a striking departure from the optimism of many Enlightenment thinkers, who believed that reason and learning would lead to human betterment. Rousseau challenged that assumption, suggesting that civilization had enslaved humans to vanity, competition, and artificial desires. His next major work, Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, published in 1755, continued this line of thought. Rousseau distinguished between two kinds of inequality: natural inequality based on differences in age, strength, or intelligence, and moral or political inequality, which arises from human conventions. He argued that the latter had no basis in nature and was instead the product of unjust social arrangements. According to Rousseau, the invention of private property marked the beginning of this injustice. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. This bold assertion challenged the foundation of European social order, which rested on inherited privilege, land ownership, and legal hierarchies. Rousseau saw inequality not as inevitable, but as a distortion of human nature. In his view, human beings were naturally good and equal in the state of nature, but society had corrupted them. This was a powerful and controversial claim, one that made Rousseau a target for criticism, but also a source of inspiration for those seeking social change. Rousseau's most influential political work came in 1762 with the publication of The Social Contract. Its opening line remains one of the most famous declarations in political theory: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." In this book, Rousseau asked a fundamental question: how can individuals be free in a society governed by laws? His answer was radical. True freedom is not the absence of restraint, but obedience to laws that one has helped to make. In other words, liberty means living under rules that reflect the general will of the people. The concept of the general will was at the heart of Rousseau's political philosophy. Unlike the mere sum of individual preferences, the general will represents the collective interest of the people as a whole. It is not determined by opinion polls or majority votes, but by a deeper reflection on what is best for the community. Rousseau believed that when citizens act not out of private interest but in pursuit of the common good, they express the general will. In this way, true democracy is not just a procedure but a moral commitment. Rousseau's vision of democracy was demanding. It required active participation from all citizens, who must be educated, engaged, and willing to subordinate private desires to public needs. He was deeply critical of representative systems in which people handed over their sovereignty to a ruling class. As he put it, "The English people believes itself to be free. It is greatly mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of parliament. As soon as they are elected, the people is enslaved." This rejection of representation set Rousseau apart from more moderate thinkers and foreshadowed the radical democratic movements that would emerge later. At the same time, Rousseau was not a champion of unrestricted individualism. He believed that freedom must be guided by civic virtue and that society should be shaped to encourage mutual respect and shared responsibility. His ideas on education, expressed in Emile, also published in 1762, emphasized the development of moral character rather than rote knowledge. He advocated for child-centered learning, allowing the natural curiosity of children to guide their education. Emile was both a treatise on education and a philosophical novel, blending personal reflection with social critique. Emile also contained a section called The Profession of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar, in which Rousseau laid out his views on religion. He rejected both atheism and religious dogmatism, instead advocating a form of natural religion based on conscience and inner feeling. This passage was so controversial that it led to the book being banned and Rousseau being forced into exile. He would spend much of the rest of his life moving between countries, seeking refuge from hostile authorities. Despite, or perhaps because of, his unorthodox views, Rousseau had a profound impact on Enlightenment thought. His writings were translated, debated, and studied across Europe. Though some Enlightenment figures, like Voltaire, mocked his emotional style and romantic idealism, others were deeply influenced by his ideas. His emphasis on equality, participatory democracy, and social justice resonated with growing dissatisfaction among the emerging middle and lower classes. Rousseau's influence extended beyond political theory. He helped shape the emerging Romantic movement in literature and art, which emphasized emotion, nature, and individual experience. His belief in the moral purity of natural life challenged the rationalism and urban elitism of other Enlightenment thinkers. In this way, Rousseau stood at a crossroads, both part of the Enlightenment and a critic of its assumptions. Perhaps more than any other philosophe, Rousseau captured the tensions at the heart of the Enlightenment. Between reason and emotion, individual freedom and collective responsibility, progress and simplicity. His ideas would echo loudly in the French Revolution, particularly among the Jacobins, who invoked his concept of the general will to justify radical political action. Yet Rousseau himself never called for violent revolution. His vision was moral, not militant, centered on the transformation of human hearts and institutions through virtue and education. Rousseau died in 1778, the same year as Voltaire. Though the two men could not have been more different in style and temperament, their deaths marked the end of an era. The Enlightenment had produced a rich and diverse range of ideas, from cautious reformism to radical egalitarianism. Rousseau's legacy would be carried forward by revolutionaries and reformers alike, each interpreting his writings in their own way. As the French Enlightenment gathered momentum in the mid-18th century, one monumental project came to symbolize the movement's highest ambitions, the Encyclopedie, ou Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers. This vast work was not merely a collection of definitions or technical terms. It was an intellectual revolution in print. At a time when knowledge was still controlled by religious and political authorities, the Encyclopédie sought to democratize information, challenge dogma, and lay the groundwork for a more rational and informed society. The project was launched in the year 1747 under the initial direction of Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, a mathematician and physicist, and Denis Diderot, a writer and philosopher. While other encyclopedias had been published before, none approached the scale or philosophical ambition of this undertaking. Diderot and d'Alembert envisioned a work that would map out all of human knowledge across the sciences, arts, crafts, and philosophy, and present it through the lens of Enlightenment reason. Their inspiration came partly from earlier British models, such as Ephraim Chambers's Encyclopedie, but the French Encyclopedie quickly surpassed its predecessors in both scope and daring. The editors recruited leading intellectuals from across Europe, including Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Buffon, Turgot, and Helvetius, to contribute articles. Some entries were technical descriptions of machines, manufacturing processes, or medical practices. Others were bold critiques of religion, government, censorship, and inequality, topics that directly challenged the foundations of the ancien regime. The structure of the Encyclopedie was both alphabetical and hierarchical. While readers could look up individual entries, the editors also included extensive cross-references that encouraged readers to make connections across different fields. The Tree of Knowledge diagram in the introduction laid out the Enlightenment understanding of how various branches of knowledge were related. At the top was human reason, the guiding principle of the entire enterprise. What made the Encyclopedie so radical was not just its content, but its implicit message: knowledge belongs to everyone. In the ancien regime, knowledge had long been monopolized by institutions like the church and universities, which guarded it in Latin texts and rigid doctrines. The Encyclopedie, by contrast, was published in the vernacular French and aimed at a literate but non-specialist public. It included detailed illustrations of tools, workshops, and machines, elevating manual labor and technical skill to the same level as philosophy and literature. This elevation of the mechanical arts reflected the Enlightenment's growing respect for practical knowledge. For centuries, intellectuals had looked down on artisans and craftsmen, seeing their work as inferior to abstract thinking. The Encyclopedie challenged that prejudice by devoting significant space to trades and techniques, from blacksmithing and weaving to shipbuilding and watchmaking. In doing so, it redefined what counted as valuable knowledge and who had the right to possess it. The project quickly drew the ire of the authorities. In 1752, after the publication of the second volume, the French Council of State revoked the royal privilege that had allowed the work to be printed. The Jesuits and other conservative factions denounced the Encyclopedie as subversive and irreligious. They objected not only to its content, but to its tone: ironic, critical, and irreverent. The Church placed several volumes on the index of forbidden books. At one point, the editors were forced to suspend publication and work in secret. Despite these obstacles, Diderot and his collaborators persisted. For more than 2 decades, they coordinated writing, editing, and printing, often under intense scrutiny. Diderot, in particular, bore the burden of managing contributors, revising manuscripts, and outmaneuvering censors. He hid controversial articles within seemingly neutral topics, smuggled material to sympathetic printers in Switzerland and the Netherlands, and used allegory or coded language to bypass restrictions. One technique he used was the inclusion of subversive content within articles on seemingly technical subjects. For instance, under the entry for cannibals, one could find veiled criticisms of European colonialism. Under torture, the article might include a reasoned argument against the practice while outwardly describing its legal use. These strategies allowed the Encyclopedie to deliver Enlightenment messages even under censorship. By the time the final volume was completed in the year 1772, the Encyclopedie consisted of 28 volumes, 17 of text and 11 of plates, with over 70,000 articles and more than 21 million words. It had involved the labor of over 100 contributors, including philosophers, scientists, artisans, and engineers. The work had been published in thousands of copies and translated into multiple languages, reaching readers across Europe and beyond. The impact of the Encyclopedie was enormous. It became a symbol of intellectual resistance and an embodiment of Enlightenment values: reason, secularism, tolerance, and the democratization of knowledge. It offered a vision of society in which truth was discovered through observation and critical thinking, not handed down by authority. It encouraged readers to question tradition, recognize injustice, and imagine alternatives. Diderot himself saw the Encyclopedie as more than a reference work. He believed that its purpose was to change the general way of thinking. It was a tool not only for education, but for transformation. In a society where books could be burned and authors imprisoned, publishing such a work was a political act. The Encyclopedie challenged the monopoly on knowledge, disrupted hierarchies, and empowered the emerging bourgeoisie with ideas that would soon become revolutionary. However, it is important to understand that the Encyclopedie was not a manifesto. It did not call for the immediate overthrow of the monarchy or the church. Many of its contributors were cautious reformers, not revolutionaries, but by presenting knowledge as something dynamic, secular, and open to revision, the work undermined the very assumptions on which absolutist power rested. The Encyclopedie also played a role in unifying the various strands of the Enlightenment. It brought together scientific discoveries, philosophical debates, economic theories, and artistic expressions into a single intellectual ecosystem. Readers who encountered an article on geometry might also find themselves reading about education or political liberty. The work encouraged interdisciplinary thinking and broke down the barriers between fields of knowledge. Its legacy would outlast the Enlightenment itself. In the decades following its publication, the ideas popularized by the Encyclopedie would inspire reformers, revolutionaries, and educators. The French revolutionaries would draw on its critiques of privilege and its celebration of human reason. Later encyclopedias, both in Europe and abroad, would follow its model of comprehensive and accessible knowledge. Even in the modern age of digital information, the dream of organizing and sharing human understanding owes much to Diderot's vision. While the Encyclopedie aimed to reshape how people thought by organizing and spreading knowledge, Enlightenment ideas also took root in the more personal and conversational spaces of 18th-century France. In the salons of Paris, in bustling coffeehouses, and in the pages of newspapers and pamphlets, new ideas moved from the hands of writers to the minds of the reading and speaking public. These were not merely places for leisure or gossip. They were laboratories of opinion, platforms for debate, and vital engines of cultural transformation. The salon, in particular, became one of the most influential institutions of the French Enlightenment. These gatherings, usually hosted in private homes by educated women of the upper classes, brought together aristocrats, writers, scientists, philosophers, and artists for conversation. What made salons unique was not just their content, but their structure. They operated outside the control of universities, churches, or state institutions. They were informal but intellectually serious spaces where participants could exchange ideas, critique texts, and engage in spirited yet respectful discussion. Salons developed gradually during the 17th century, but reached their height in the 18th. Paris was their epicenter. Among the most famous salonières, women who hosted and curated these gatherings, were Madame Geoffrin, Madame du Deffand, and Mademoiselle de l'Espinasse. These women, though often excluded from formal political power and academic positions, played a crucial role in shaping the Enlightenment by deciding who could attend, what topics were discussed, and how conversations unfolded. Madame Geoffrin's salon, for instance, became a central meeting place for the philosophes, including Diderot, d'Alembert, Montesquieu, and Turgot. She offered her guests not only hospitality, but financial support and editorial advice. Her home was both a cultural hub and an intellectual sanctuary where Enlightenment thinkers could test ideas, refine arguments, and build networks of support. Though not all salonières were aligned politically or philosophically, they collectively helped foster a culture of rational debate and mutual respect. Salons blurred traditional boundaries. Nobles mingled with commoners, men engaged with women in serious intellectual exchange, and guests debated topics ranging from astronomy and literature to theology and economic theory. The rules of polite conversation meant that participants had to defend their views with reason, not authority or emotion. This emphasis on civility and logic mirrored the Enlightenment's broader commitment to discourse over dogma. Beyond salons, coffeehouses also played a critical role in shaping public opinion. Imported from the Ottoman Empire and first appearing in France in the late 17th century, coffeehouses quickly became popular among merchants, professionals, and artisans. Unlike salons, which were more exclusive, coffee houses were open to paying customers from various social backgrounds. They served as centers of news, political discussion, and literary culture. In these spaces, newspapers and pamphlets circulated widely. Readers would read aloud to those who were illiterate, sparking group discussions. Debates over the latest scientific discoveries, political rumors, or philosophical essays would animate the tables. Coffee houses thus served as an early form of the public sphere, a concept later developed by thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, where private individuals could come together to discuss matters of common concern. The explosion of print culture during this period further expanded the reach of Enlightenment ideas. The number of periodicals, journals, and pamphlets grew dramatically in the 18th century. Though official censorship remained in place and many works had to be published abroad and smuggled into France, the demand for reading material was insatiable. Publishers often found ways to navigate or evade restrictions, and underground printing networks flourished. Pamphlets, in particular, became powerful tools of persuasion. Short, inexpensive, and easy to distribute, they allowed writers to address specific issues in a timely and accessible format. Some pamphlets attacked the abuses of the monarchy or the church. Others defended Enlightenment thinkers against official condemnation. Still others explained new scientific theories or argued for reforms in education, criminal justice, or taxation. Many were anonymous, allowing authors to speak more freely and directly than they could in more formal publications. Journals and literary magazines also helped create a shared intellectual culture. Publications like Mercure de France, Journal des Savants, and Nouvelles Ecclésiastiques reported on current debates, reviewed new books, and published letters from readers. These platforms enabled thinkers in different regions to engage with one another's ideas, creating a kind of republic of letters that transcended national and social boundaries. An essential feature of this new culture was its reliance on public opinion. Whereas political power in the ancien regime resided in the monarchy and nobility, Enlightenment thinkers increasingly believed that legitimacy should come from the people, not necessarily in a revolutionary or democratic sense at first, but as a moral and rational community capable of judgment. They saw public opinion as a force that could shape policy, restrain corruption, and push rulers toward reform. The transformation of public opinion did not happen automatically. It was cultivated through argument, persuasion, and the careful presentation of ideas. Enlightenment writers developed a range of rhetorical strategies to reach their audiences. Some, like Voltaire, used satire and irony to undermine their opponents. Others, like Rousseau, employed emotional appeals to stir empathy and moral reflection. Still others relied on data, observation, and carefully reasoned logic to build their cases. This new focus on public opinion had real effects. For example, the public campaigns Voltaire led to exonerate victims of injustice, such as Jean Calas, depended on the ability to mobilize sympathy and outrage through print and conversation. Similarly, debates over religious tolerance, economic policy, and legal reform increasingly took place not just behind closed doors, but in the broader realm of public discourse. It is important to recognize, however, that the Enlightenment public was not universal. Women, while active in salons, were largely excluded from formal politics and often dismissed in philosophical writing. The urban poor, though exposed to new ideas through popular literature and public readings, did not always share the worldview of the bourgeois intellectuals. Censorship and repression still limited what could be said openly. Yet compared to previous centuries, the 18th century saw a remarkable expansion in who could participate in shaping ideas. Salons and coffee houses also had their tensions. While they encouraged debate, they often reinforced social hierarchies and expectations of decorum. Not all topics were welcome, and certain voices were privileged over others. Even so, these spaces provided crucial opportunities for engagement, experimentation, and the diffusion of knowledge. By the eve of the French Revolution, the combination of informal conversation, printed material, and a growing sense of public engagement had created a powerful intellectual environment. Enlightenment ideas were no longer confined to a few philosophers or secret manuscripts. They were alive in the spoken word, on the printed page, and in the minds of an increasingly critical and articulate public. The Enlightenment was not a movement of isolated geniuses, but a cultural shift powered by networks of communication. In the salons and coffeehouses of France, ordinary men and women encountered new visions of justice, equality, and human potential. They debated, argued, agreed, and disagreed. But in doing so, they prepared the ground for deeper transformations to come. As Enlightenment thought advanced across France in the 18th century, one institution stood firmly in its path: the Catholic Church. The Church was not merely a spiritual authority. It was an entrenched political, legal, and cultural force intertwined with the French monarchy and the very structure of the ancien regime. Yet this once unquestionable authority was steadily eroded as Enlightenment thinkers turned their critical focus toward religion. They did not all reject belief in God, but they began to ask bold new questions. Must morality depend on divine revelation? Can religion coexist with reason? What happens when faith becomes a tool of oppression? The answers came in many forms, but they shared a common aim: to separate reason from religious dogma and to place human understanding at the center of ethical and philosophical inquiry. Some thinkers embraced deism, a belief in a rational creator who set the universe in motion but did not interfere with human affairs. Others advanced more radical critiques, openly attacking the clergy, religious intolerance, and the historical abuses of the Church. In France, the Catholic Church had long played a dominant role in public life. It controlled education, censored publications, collected tithes, and maintained significant judicial and political privileges. The clergy, especially members of the higher ranks, often came from noble families and aligned themselves with royal interests. Although many parish priests served their communities faithfully, the Church as an institution became a symbol of inequality, privilege, and resistance to progress. The Enlightenment challenged this authority on multiple fronts. Voltaire, perhaps the most famous critic of clerical power, did not call for the abolition of religion, but despised what he saw as its misuse. He often distinguished between genuine religious feeling and institutional corruption. His famous cry, "Écrasez l'infâme," or "crush the infamous thing," was aimed not at belief in God, but at religious fanaticism, persecution, and the collusion of church and state. Voltaire's critiques were grounded in specific cases. He exposed the judicial murder of Jean Calas, a Protestant wrongly executed by Catholic authorities. He denounced the Inquisition, the expulsion of religious minorities, and the censorship of scientific and philosophical works. His writings ridiculed superstition and clerical hypocrisy while defending freedom of conscience. To Voltaire, a society ruled by priests was inherently dangerous because it replaced rational law with arbitrary authority. Other thinkers took a more systematic approach. Paul-Henri Thierry, Baron d'Holbach, was one of the most outspoken atheists of the Enlightenment. In his System of Nature, published under a pseudonym in the year 1770, d'Holbach argued that the universe was governed entirely by natural laws and that religion was a human invention used to manipulate the masses. He believed that fear and ignorance sustained religious belief, and that moral principles could be grounded in reason and empathy rather than divine command. D'Holbach's materialism shocked even some of his fellow philosophes. Unlike deists, who still saw a divine creator behind the order of the cosmos, d'Holbach saw no need for any supernatural explanation. For him, the laws of physics, biology, and human psychology explained everything worth knowing. Religion, in this view, was not merely false but harmful, a tool used by rulers to maintain control over an ignorant population. Yet deism, rather than atheism, became the more common position among Enlightenment thinkers. Deists rejected the idea of miracles, divine revelation, and scriptural authority, but they believed in a creator who could be discovered through reason. This God did not intervene in daily life, judge the dead, or require worship in temples. Instead, the deist God was like a cosmic watchmaker. Having designed the universe with precision, he then stepped back and allowed it to run according to its own laws. Deism appealed to many Enlightenment writers because it allowed them to reconcile belief with science. They could admire the harmony of the natural world, endorse moral values, and yet reject the rituals, dogmas, and hierarchies of organized religion. Thinkers such as Rousseau, despite his frequent criticisms of civilization, expressed belief in a natural religion grounded in conscience. In Émile, Rousseau's Savoyard Vicar described a heartfelt faith untainted by theological argument or institutional control. The spread of Enlightenment critiques was aided by the growing accessibility of books, journals, and pamphlets. Anti-clerical works circulated widely, both legally and through underground networks. Satirical pamphlets mocked the corruption of monks, the wealth of bishops, and the sexual misconduct of priests. Philosophical essays challenged traditional doctrines with historical analysis, scientific evidence, and moral reasoning. Even more moderate Enlightenment figures, such as Montesquieu, contributed to this climate of questioning. In The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu argued for religious tolerance and the separation of religious and civil authority. He admired the pluralism of England, where different denominations coexisted under a limited monarchy, and he condemned the violence of forced conversions and religious wars. Montesquieu believed that religion should be a private matter and that civil peace depended on respect for diverse beliefs. This push for tolerance was not purely theoretical. In France, Protestants had lived under legal and social restrictions since the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in the year 1685. Though some communities continued to practice their faith in secret, they faced persecution, exclusion from public life, and the constant threat of punishment. Enlightenment thinkers advocated for their rights, arguing that conscience could not be coerced and that civil society must be based on mutual respect rather than enforced orthodoxy. The call for religious tolerance also extended to Jews, who had long been marginalized in French society. While prejudice against Jews remained widespread, some Enlightenment writers, most notably Moses Mendelssohn in Germany, argued for Jewish emancipation and equal rights. In France, thinkers like Mirabeau and Abbé Grégoire would later build on Enlightenment principles to promote Jewish inclusion during the Revolutionary era. However, it would be misleading to suggest that all Enlightenment critiques of religion were free from prejudice. Some anti-clerical writings slid into mockery and bigotry. The same Enlightenment that promoted tolerance sometimes reinforced stereotypes, particularly when describing non-Christian faiths or marginalized communities. The tension between universal ideals and cultural biases remained unresolved. The Enlightenment's relationship with religion was thus complex. It did not simply replace faith with reason, nor did it produce a single unified doctrine. Instead, it opened up a space for debate, a space in which individuals could question inherited beliefs, examine religious institutions, and explore new ethical frameworks. For some, this led to a purified and personal form of faith. For others, it led to secular morality or outright rejection of religion. The consequences of this shift were profound. By challenging the theological foundations of authority, Enlightenment thinkers weakened the ideological supports of monarchy and hierarchy. They invited citizens to think for themselves, to judge right from wrong without appealing to scripture or tradition. They called for a society governed by law, reason, and shared humanity, not by revelation, dogma, or clerical decree. This new moral vision did not abolish religion, but it transformed its role. Religion would no longer be the sole guardian of truth or the exclusive source of values. Instead, it became one voice among many in a pluralistic society. The Enlightenment made room for spiritual diversity, ethical inquiry, and the right to believe, or not believe, without coercion. As Enlightenment thinkers in France questioned traditional beliefs in politics, religion, and philosophy, they also began to challenge long-established ideas about wealth, trade, and the role of the state in economic life. Just as reason could expose the flaws in monarchy or religious dogma, it could also be applied to economics to uncover more rational, productive, and just systems of exchange. In doing so, Enlightenment economists laid the intellectual foundations for modern capitalism, reshaping how people understood the relationship between government, markets, and society. In the early 18th century, France remained largely committed to mercantilist economic policies. Under mercantilism, wealth was seen as finite. and nations competed to accumulate it primarily through the accumulation of precious metals and the control of trade. The state was expected to intervene heavily in the economy to regulate production, impose tariffs, and protect domestic industries. This system had been refined under ministers like Jean-Baptiste Colbert during the reign of Louis XIV and continued to dominate French economic thinking well into the 18th century. However, by mid-century, this model was coming under increasing scrutiny. A new school of economic thought emerged that sought to replace rigid state control with a belief in natural economic laws. Just as Newton had discovered physical laws governing the universe, Enlightenment economists believed it was possible to uncover economic laws that could lead to greater prosperity and social harmony. This marked the birth of what would become known as political economy, a field that treated economic activity as a subject of rational study rather than court policy. One of the earliest and most influential groups to articulate these new ideas in France were the physiocrats. The term comes from the Greek words meaning government of nature, and it reflects their belief that the economy should be governed by natural laws rather than artificial regulations. The physiocrats argued that the true source of a nation's wealth was not gold or silver, but the productive capacity of the land, especially agriculture. François Quesnay, a physician to Louis XV and the central figure among the physiocrats, published his Tableau économique in the year 1758. This pioneering work attempted to map the flow of goods and income through the economy. Quesnay emphasized that only agriculture produced a true surplus, as it generated more than it consumed. He divided society into three classes: the productive class, farmers; the sterile class, manufacturers and artisans; and the proprietors, landowners. According to Quesnay, government should avoid interfering with these natural processes and instead allow free trade in grain and agricultural goods. The physiocrats introduced a revolutionary concept, laissez-faire, meaning let do or let it be. In economic terms, this implied that markets function best when left alone, without government interference. They called for the elimination of internal tolls, price controls, and excessive taxation. Instead, they proposed a single tax on landowners, who were seen as the primary beneficiaries of the agricultural surplus. While the physiocrats focused on agriculture, their general principles influenced a broader critique of government overreach. Their writings circulated widely, and they attracted the interest of figures like Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot, a statesman and reform-minded economist who would later serve as Controller General of Finances under Louis XVI. Turgot, influenced by both the physiocrats and Enlightenment rationalism, believed in simplifying the tax system, reducing state spending, and encouraging economic freedom. During his brief tenure in government from 1774 to 1776, he implemented several reforms aimed at modernizing the French economy. He abolished certain feudal dues, suppressed guilds that restricted labor, and lifted controls on the grain trade. Though many of these reforms were reversed after his dismissal, Turgot's ideas would continue to shape economic thought and reform efforts in the years leading up to the Revolution. Another important development in Enlightenment economics was the shift in focus from land to labor and exchange. While the physiocrats emphasized agriculture, other thinkers began to recognize the importance of industry, trade, and the value created by human effort. This perspective found its most influential expression outside France in the work of the Scottish economist Adam Smith. Though Smith was not French, his ideas quickly influenced French economists and philosophes. In his major work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, published in the year 1776, Smith argued that wealth was not based on the accumulation of precious metals, but on the productivity of labor. He introduced the concept of the division of labor as a key to increasing efficiency and output. A famous example from his work described a pin factory, where dividing the production process into specialized tasks dramatically increased output. Smith also expanded on the idea of laissez-faire, advocating for minimal government intervention in economic life. He believed that individuals pursuing their own interests would, through the mechanism of the invisible hand, contribute to the overall good of society. This idea resonated strongly with Enlightenment ideals of natural law, individual liberty, and rational order. In France, Smith's work was embraced by liberal thinkers who saw in it a critique of privilege and a model for reform. Figures such as Condorcet and Dupont de Nemours engaged with Smith's ideas and sought to apply them in the French context. Though Smith remained more cautious than some French economists about the limits of government intervention, his general approach aligned with Enlightenment efforts to replace arbitrary regulation with coherent, universal principles. Economic debates were not confined to theoretical writings. They played out in real-world controversies, particularly over the grain trade. In 18th-century France, bread was the staple food for most of the population, and grain prices were a matter of survival. Efforts to liberalize the grain market, influenced by physiocratic and liberal economic thought, often met with resistance. In periods of shortage, rising bread prices led to riots and political backlash. This tension revealed the challenge of applying Enlightenment theory in a society still shaped by deep inequalities and rigid traditions. The Enlightenment also introduced new ways of thinking about poverty and social welfare. Some writers, like Rousseau, saw inequality as a moral problem rooted in the structure of society. Others proposed more technical solutions, such as public education, workhouses, or charitable institutions. While consensus was rare, the idea that poverty could be studied, understood, and addressed through policy marked a significant departure from earlier views that treated it as either a divine punishment or an unchangeable fact of life. At the heart of Enlightenment, economics was a belief in progress, that human beings, through reason and observation, could create more efficient and just systems of production and distribution. Economic questions were no longer limited to court officials or guild leaders. They became part of a larger philosophical conversation about human well-being, freedom, and the structure of society. By the final decades of the 18th century, France had become a laboratory of economic thought. Competing models, mercantilism, physiocracy, and liberal capitalism, vied for influence in the royal court, the salons, and the pages of Enlightenment literature. While the monarchy remained cautious and often inconsistent in implementing reforms, the seeds of economic transformation had been sown. These ideas would find new urgency as financial crises mounted, and the burden of taxation grew increasingly intolerable for the common people. Economic liberalism, once an abstract ideal, would become a battleground as the old order struggled to adapt to new realities. As Enlightenment ideas gained momentum in 18th century France, their spread was anything but smooth or uncontested. Although the philosophes believed in free inquiry and open debate, they operated within a society where censorship was institutionalized, dissent was criminalized, and the boundaries of acceptable thought were tightly guarded by both church and state. The very ideas that called for liberty, tolerance, and reason often had to find their way into the public sphere through secret channels and strategic disguises. In this environment, the printed word became both a weapon and a battleground. Censorship in France was part of a larger system of control maintained by the absolute monarchy. Every book published in the kingdom required official approval or permission tacite granted by royal censors. These censors, appointed by the state, were tasked with protecting public morals and ensuring that printed materials did not challenge religious orthodoxy, the authority of the king, or the stability of society. A work deemed offensive could be banned, seized, or publicly burned. Authors and publishers could face fines, imprisonment, or exile. Despite this restrictive environment, the Enlightenment thrived. Writers developed a variety of methods to bypass censorship and reach their readers. Some employed satire, irony, or allegory to mask their critiques. Others published their works abroad, in places like Geneva, Amsterdam, or London, and then smuggled them back into France. These underground publications, known collectively as libelles or clandestine literature, became an essential part of the Enlightenment's success. The libelles covered a wide range of genres and tones. Some were sophisticated philosophical treatises published without royal approval. Others were scandalous pamphlets filled with gossip, sexual innuendo, and political slander. Many targeted the monarchy, the church, or members of the aristocracy. These texts were often anonymous, and for good reason. Publishing even mild criticism of the king or the clergy could result in harsh punishment. Voltaire was one of the most adept writers at navigating censorship. His works were frequently banned, yet they circulated widely and were widely read. To avoid repression, he often published under false names or claimed that his writings had been printed in foreign cities. His philosophical letters was officially condemned and burned, but readers eagerly sought it out. Voltaire also used his personal connections and wealth to protect himself. He lived for many years in Ferney, near the Swiss border, which allowed him to move in and out of French territory more freely. Denis Diderot, the co-editor of the Encyclopedie, faced even greater challenges. His involvement with this massive project brought him under constant scrutiny. In 1749, after the second volume appeared, the French government temporarily shut down the project. Diderot was arrested and imprisoned in the fortress of Vincennes for several months. Despite the setback, he continued to coordinate the work, sometimes in secret, sometimes in open defiance. When official support was withdrawn, private publishers took over, and the Encyclopédie continued to grow. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, too, experienced persecution. His novel Émile and his political treatise The Social Contract, both published in 1762, were condemned by authorities in Paris and Geneva. The books were banned and publicly burned. Rousseau was forced to flee, living in exile and often in hiding. Though he was not the first thinker to face such repression, his case became emblematic of the growing tension between Enlightenment ideals and the institutions determined to suppress them. One of the paradoxes of censorship was that it often increased the appeal of forbidden works. When a book was banned or burned, it became more desirable, a symbol of forbidden truth. Smugglers, booksellers, and underground printers played a crucial role in meeting this demand. They formed a shadow network of Enlightenment distribution, often moving banned texts across borders, hidden in shipments of legal goods. These operations were risky, but also profitable. The market for Enlightenment literature was strong, and many readers were willing to pay high prices for copies of controversial books. This underground world of publishing did not operate in isolation. It was closely connected to the salons, coffee houses, and correspondence networks that had become central to Enlightenment life. When a new book arrived in Paris, it might be read aloud in a salon, discussed in letters between thinkers, or debated in private gatherings. Enlightenment ideas thus spread not only through print, but through conversation, performance, and rumor. Beyond formal censorship, the state also employed surveillance and intimidation. The police kept files on writers and intellectuals, monitored printers, and sometimes used informants to identify subversive behavior. Writers had to navigate a complex landscape of approval, evasion, and risk. Some chose to self-censor, softening their arguments or cloaking them in ambiguity. Others pushed boundaries deliberately, courting controversy to gain attention. Censorship also revealed contradictions within the monarchy. While some royal officials supported repression, others quietly encouraged reformist ideas. A few Enlightenment thinkers even held positions at court. Anne Robert Turgot, the economist and reformer, served as a minister under Louis XVI. The Marquis de Condorcet, a mathematician and political thinker, worked on educational reforms. These figures walked a fine line between advocacy and loyalty, often promoting Enlightenment principles from within the state. Meanwhile, the Church continued to play an active role in censorship. The Index of Forbidden Books, maintained by the Catholic Church, listed works considered dangerous to faith or morals. Inclusion on the index could harm an author's reputation and limit a book's circulation, though enforcement varied from place to place. The Jesuits in particular were known for their strict defense of orthodoxy. Yet, even within the clergy, there were some who sympathized with Enlightenment goals, especially in calls for educational reform and moral renewal. Despite the risks, the Enlightenment's printed word continued to spread. Works that were once confined to elite circles became accessible to broader audiences. Cheap editions, serialized journals, and public readings brought philosophy into the streets. the distinction between official and unofficial knowledge began to blur. Enlightenment thought, once a challenge to the establishment, was becoming a cultural force that no law or decree could entirely suppress. The long-term effects of this struggle over print and censorship were profound. It helped create a new public, curious, critical, and increasingly skeptical of traditional authority. It also exposed the limits of the state's ability to control information in a changing world. The more the government tried to silence Enlightenment voices, the more those voices found new ways to be heard. By the end of the 18th century, the printed word had become a catalyst of transformation. Books and pamphlets were no longer passive carriers of information. They were instruments of social change. They offered readers new ways of seeing the world and new tools for imagining what it might become. By the latter half of the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas had begun to reach beyond intellectual circles, salons, and underground presses. They were no longer simply the musings of philosophers or the quiet discussions of elites. These ideas had started to enter the corridors of power. Some monarchs, ministers, and advisors, aware of the growing criticisms of traditional authority, began to flirt with reform. They hoped that by selectively embracing Enlightenment principles, they could modernize their kingdoms, improve administration, and preserve their rule. In France, however, this effort proved fraught with contradictions and resistance. The French monarchy, under Louis XV and later Louis XVI, faced mounting economic, social, and political pressures. The kingdom was burdened by debt, a deeply unequal tax system, and widespread dissatisfaction among both the bourgeoisie and peasantry. At the same time, Enlightenment thinkers were proposing rational solutions to these problems, calling for fair taxation, efficient governance, and a rethinking of legal and religious institutions. Within this context, the monarchy began to experiment with reforms that reflected, at least in part, the spirit of the age. One of the earliest and most significant figures to embody this attempt at reform from above was Anne Robert Jacques Turgot. Appointed Controller General of Finances under Louis XVI in the year 1774, Turgot had long been involved in economic thought and had connections to Enlightenment circles, including the physiocrats. He believed that France's fiscal problems could be alleviated through liberal economic reforms, reduced government spending, and a more rational system of taxation. Turgot's reforms were ambitious. He abolished corvée labor, a system that forced peasants to provide unpaid labor for state projects. He deregulated the grain trade, hoping that freer markets would lead to more efficient distribution and lower prices. He attempted to reduce the privileges of guilds, which he saw as outdated and obstructive to economic mobility. Perhaps most radically, he proposed a universal land tax that would apply equally to nobles and commoners, a direct challenge to the fiscal exemptions enjoyed by the First and Second Estates. While Turgot's vision was grounded in Enlightenment ideals of equality and efficiency, it faced stiff opposition from powerful vested interests. The nobility, who had long enjoyed exemption from direct taxation, resisted any attempt to reduce their privileges. The Parlement, regional high courts dominated by nobles, refused to register his reforms. Even within the royal court, his efforts were seen as too disruptive. In the year 1776, under pressure from the aristocracy and the Queen, Marie Antoinette, Turgot was dismissed. His departure marked a turning point, though other reform-minded ministers would follow, such as Jacques Necker and Charles-Alexandre de Calonne. The basic conflict remained. Any serious attempt to implement Enlightenment-inspired reform from above would threaten the very structure of privilege and hierarchy on which the monarchy depended. Necker, a Swiss banker appointed several times as Controller General, took a more cautious approach than Turgot. He promoted greater transparency in government spending and attempted to raise money through loans rather than new taxes. In 1781, he published a Compte rendu au roi, a public account of royal finances, which won him wide popular support. However, like Turgot, he faced resistance from entrenched elites and was eventually dismissed. Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, who followed Necker, also tried to implement fiscal reforms, including a land tax on all property owners. To bypass the parlements, he convened an assembly of notables in 1787. hoping that hand-picked elites would support his plans. Instead, the assembly balked, demanding broader consultation. This failure eventually led to the convocation of the Estates General in 1789, the body that would set the revolution in motion. Throughout these years, the monarchy's attempts at reform exposed a fundamental contradiction. On one hand, the crown needed Enlightenment ideas to solve the kingdom's growing problems. On the other hand, those very ideas threatened the foundations of absolutist rule. Reforms that appealed to reason, fairness, and public accountability challenged the privileges of the nobility, the traditional authority of the church, and the unquestioned power of the king himself. This paradox was further complicated by the monarchy's cultural engagement with Enlightenment thought. Louis XVI, though indecisive and conservative by temperament, was not entirely hostile to Enlightenment ideas. He supported some scientific initiatives, read works by Enlightenment authors, and permitted a certain level of intellectual freedom. His wife, Marie Antoinette, patronized the arts and participated in courtly discussions that sometimes reflected modern views. But neither of them grasped the depth of change occurring in French society. Their efforts at reform were piecemeal and reactive, failing to address the broader crisis of legitimacy. Moreover, the monarchy's embrace of Enlightenment culture often appeared superficial. At Versailles, nobles staged amateur performances of Enlightenment plays and discussed Voltaire over dinner, but the palace remained a symbol of extravagance and social inequality. The contrast between enlightened rhetoric and political inaction deepened public cynicism. Meanwhile, outside the court, public debate intensified. The proliferation of newspapers, pamphlets, and political clubs allowed citizens, especially the educated bourgeoisie, to articulate their frustrations and demand deeper changes. Many saw the failure of reform from above as proof that the existing system could not be saved. If the monarchy could not, or would not, implement Enlightenment principles, then perhaps it was time for a new form of government altogether. Still, it would be unfair to suggest that all Enlightenment thinkers opposed the monarchy. Some, like Voltaire, believed that enlightened monarchs could be effective agents of progress. This belief in enlightened absolutism, or benevolent despotism, gained traction in other parts of Europe, particularly under rulers like Frederick the Great of Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, and Catherine the Great of Russia. These monarchs implemented reforms in education, law, and religious policy, often citing Enlightenment ideals. However, their French counterpart struggled to follow suit, constrained by a more rigid aristocracy and a deeper legacy of privilege. In the final years before the French Revolution, the failure of reform from above became increasingly clear. The monarchy had lost credibility among reformers, failed to placate the nobility, and alienated growing segments of the population. Financial crisis, rising food prices, and political paralysis created a combustible atmosphere. When Louis XVI finally agreed to summon the Estates General in 1789, it was seen not as an act of strength, but of desperation. What began as an attempt to stabilize royal authority would soon unleash forces far beyond the king's control. The Enlightenment, once a movement of thinkers and books, was about to become a revolution of people and action. As Enlightenment ideas spread across France in the 18th century, their influence did not remain confined within the boundaries of Europe. Across the Atlantic, in the British colonies of North America, these same ideas would help inspire a revolution. The American struggle for independence from British rule became one of the most striking examples of Enlightenment thought put into political practice. For many French observers, the American Revolution was more than a colonial rebellion. It was living proof that rational principles of liberty, equality, and representative government could be realized. In France, the Enlightenment had always been a transnational movement. French thinkers read and engaged with English philosophers like John Locke, Scottish economists like Adam Smith, and German naturalists and jurists. Ideas circulated through correspondence, translations, journals, and diplomatic visits. French writers like Montesquieu had admired the British system of constitutional monarchy, even if their understanding was sometimes idealized. When revolution broke out in the American colonies, many Enlightenment thinkers saw an opportunity to witness their theories in action. The roots of the American Revolution were partly economic and political. The colonists resented taxation without representation, British mercantile restrictions, and the military presence of British troops. But just as important were the intellectual justifications for rebellion. The Declaration of Independence, drafted in the year 1776 by Thomas Jefferson, was steeped in Enlightenment philosophy. Jefferson drew heavily on the works of John Locke, whose theory of natural rights had argued that governments existed to protect life, liberty, and property, and that when they failed to do so, the people had a right to revolt. French intellectuals quickly recognized the parallels. The American colonists, in their view, were not simply rejecting British authority, they were asserting universal principles. Voltaire, who had long admired the relative freedoms of the English-speaking world, expressed support for the American cause. Even Rousseau, though more skeptical of representative government, would have seen echoes of his belief in the sovereignty of the people. French involvement in the American War of Independence began as a strategic decision. The French government, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War and eager to weaken Britain, saw an opportunity in the colonial revolt. In the year 1778, France formally allied with the American colonies, providing military and financial support. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman inspired by Enlightenment ideals, traveled to America and fought alongside George Washington. Lafayette became a symbol of Franco-American friendship and the shared pursuit of liberty. French soldiers, sailors, and officers who served in America witnessed firsthand a society grappling with ideas of constitutional government, individual rights, and civil equality. Though the new American Republic had its contradictions, particularly regarding slavery and the limited political role of women, its revolutionary experiment inspired many Frenchmen. When they returned home, they brought with them not only military experience, but political lessons and democratic aspirations. French public opinion followed the American conflict closely. Newspapers and pamphlets covered the war in detail, and translations of American documents circulated widely. The Declaration of Independence was translated into French soon after its publication. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and writings by American thinkers like Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin were read and discussed in salons and cafes. Franklin, who served as ambassador to France, became a celebrated figure, admired not only for his scientific work, but for his embodiment of Republican simplicity and Enlightenment virtue. The success of the American Revolution had a profound psychological impact. It demonstrated that Enlightenment principles were not merely theoretical or utopian. A group of colonists had rejected monarchy, written their own laws, and established a new form of government grounded in the consent of the governed. For French reformers frustrated by the resistance of the ancien regime, this achievement suggested that radical change was possible, and that it could begin with the people, not the court. However, the influence of the American Revolution in France was not immediate or uniform. The French monarchy supported the war for strategic reasons, but did not embrace its ideological implications. Louis XVI, though he authorized military aid to the Americans, remained wary of revolutionary language. French soldiers returning from America were often viewed with suspicion by royal authorities, especially if they showed signs of political enthusiasm. Among Enlightenment thinkers, reactions to the American example were also varied. Some, like Condorcet, celebrated the potential of republican government and hoped that France would follow a similar path. Others, like Voltaire, admired American liberty, but doubted whether the French people, accustomed to monarchy and social hierarchy, were prepared for such change. Still others saw in America both promise and limitation, a bold experiment, but one constrained by its reliance on slave labor and exclusion of many from political participation. Nonetheless, the American Revolution strengthened the connection between Enlightenment thought and political action. In debates over reform in the late 1780s, American examples were frequently cited. Reformers pointed to the American Constitution as evidence that a written, rational framework could replace arbitrary rule. The idea of a social contract, first proposed by philosophers like Hobbes and Rousseau, now had a real-world application. The notion of popular sovereignty, once a theoretical concept, had become institutionalized. French writers and commentators increasingly argued that if Americans could govern themselves, so too could the French. The privileges of the nobility, the burdens of taxation on the poor, the inefficiencies of absolute monarchy, all appeared more intolerable in light of American success. The old justification for monarchy, that it ensured order and stability, was now in question. If freedom could be achieved elsewhere, why not in France? The financial consequences of the war were also significant. France's support for the American Revolution further deepened its debt, straining an already fragile fiscal system. While Enlightenment thinkers praised American liberty, the French treasury was nearing collapse. The pressure to reform taxation, curb spending, and address inequality intensified. Ironically, by supporting a revolution abroad, the French monarchy had weakened its own position at home. The influence of American political philosophy reached beyond the elite. Symbols of American independence, liberty trees, Republican slogans, and tricolor cockades began to appear in France. Though the revolution in France would take a different course, the American example provided both a model and a warning. It showed that Enlightenment ideals could inspire real change, but it also underscored the risks of challenging entrenched power. The American Revolution, then, was more than a distant conflict. It was a mirror in which French society could see its own contradictions and possibilities. It offered a vision of what might come after monarchy, a society based on laws, not privilege, on consent, not birthright. As France moved closer to its own revolutionary crisis, the echoes of America's struggle for independence would grow louder. Enlightenment thought, now proven on the battlefield and in constitutional assemblies, would become the foundation upon which French revolutionaries would build their demands for liberty, equality, and fraternity. By the final years of the 18th century, Enlightenment ideals were no longer simply topics of debate in Parisian salons or hidden within banned books. They had moved from theory to action. In France, a convergence of economic crisis, political failure, and growing popular unrest brought Enlightenment principles to the forefront of a dramatic national transformation. The French Revolution, which began in the year 1789, was deeply influenced by the intellectual ferment that had preceded it. What had once been abstract arguments about reason, equality, and the rights of man now became the rallying cries of a people demanding change. The causes of the French Revolution were many, but Enlightenment ideas provided the framework through which people understood their grievances and imagined alternatives. For decades, writers had been critiquing the abuses of the monarchy, the privileges of the nobility, the corruption of the church, and the injustice of the legal system. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu had provided not just criticism, but also new visions of government, citizenship, and moral responsibility. In the years leading up to the revolution, economic conditions in France deteriorated rapidly. Poor harvests in the 1780s led to food shortages and soaring bread prices, which hit the poor hardest. The state was drowning in debt, due in large part to its involvement in costly wars, including support for the American Revolution. Efforts to reform taxation and reduce aristocratic privilege had failed. The monarchy, increasingly seen as incompetent and disconnected, struggled to maintain legitimacy. In this atmosphere of crisis, calls for reform became calls for revolution. In 1788, Louis XVI, facing mounting pressure, agreed to summon the Estates General, the representative body that had not met in more than 175 years. The Estates General included representatives from the three traditional social orders: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. But when it convened in May of 1789, it quickly became clear that the Third Estate, the commoners, wanted more than symbolic participation. Inspired in part by Rousseau's writings on popular sovereignty and the general will, representatives of the Third Estate broke away and declared themselves the National Assembly. They claimed to speak for the nation as a whole, not merely one estate. In June of that year, they took the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had created a new constitution for France. This act marked the beginning of the revolution and the political realization of Enlightenment ideas. As events unfolded, Enlightenment language and concepts shaped both the rhetoric and the substance of revolutionary change. In August of 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that drew heavily on Enlightenment philosophy. Its opening lines declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It affirmed the principles of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. These were not vague aspirations. They were grounded in decades of philosophical debate and analysis. The Declaration echoed the writings of Locke on natural rights, Montesquieu on the separation of powers, and Rousseau on the legitimacy of government through the will of the people. It declared that law should be an expression of the general will, that all citizens were equal before the law, and that sovereignty resided in the nation, not in a king. One of the most striking features of the early revolution was how Enlightenment ideals were used to question and dismantle long-standing institutions. The privileges of the clergy and nobility were abolished. Feudal dues were eliminated. The church's property was nationalized, and civil marriage and divorce were introduced. These were not just political reforms. They were a redefinition of the moral and social order, driven by the conviction that reason and equality should replace tradition and hierarchy. The Enlightenment's influence was especially visible in the constitutional reforms of the early revolution. The Constitution of 1791 established a constitutional monarchy, reduced the king's powers, and created a legislative assembly elected by property-owning citizens. Though limited in scope, this constitution embodied the Enlightenment belief that political authority must be based on law and reason, not divine right. Education reform also reflected Enlightenment priorities. Revolutionary leaders saw education as a tool for creating informed and virtuous citizens. Efforts were made to expand public schooling, reduce the influence of the church in education, and promote secular scientific learning. These goals echoed Diderot's call to change the general way of thinking and Condorcet's vision of universal education as a pillar of democracy. However, the revolution also revealed the limits and contradictions of Enlightenment thought in practice. While the Declaration of the Rights of Man proclaimed universal principles, its application was uneven. Women, despite their participation in revolutionary events, were not granted political rights. Slavery continued in the French colonies, despite growing calls for abolition. Enlightenment values clashed with entrenched economic interests and social prejudices. Some revolutionaries sought to push Enlightenment ideals further. Figures like Maximilien Robespierre viewed virtue and reason as inseparable and believed that the new republic must be based not only on freedom but on moral purity. Others, like Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, mobilized the language of justice and equality to justify radical action. The revolution moved rapidly from constitutional reform to more radical demands for full republicanism and social equality. The storming of the Bastille in July of 1789, the Women's March on Versailles later that year, and the fall of the monarchy in 1792 all reflected a growing sense that Enlightenment ideals could no longer be contained within old frameworks. The Enlightenment had not simply prepared the minds of philosophers, it had inspired a generation to believe in their right to participate in shaping their society. By 1793, the king had been executed and France had become a republic. The National Convention, and later the Committee of Public Safety, implemented sweeping changes. Some of these, such as the metric system and reforms to the calendar, were efforts to apply rational principles to all aspects of life. Others, like the suppression of dissent and the use of the guillotine, revealed the darker side of revolutionary idealism. Despite these complexities, the connection between the Enlightenment and the early French Revolution remained strong. Revolutionary leaders spoke the language of reason, equality, and liberty. They cited Rousseau and Montesquieu in debates. They saw themselves as carrying forward the work of the philosophes, transforming society according to rational principles. International observers took note. Some praised the revolution as the triumph of Enlightenment. Others warned that it showed how easily reason could become fanaticism. In Britain, Edmund Burke condemned the revolution as a dangerous rejection of tradition. In the new United States, figures like Thomas Jefferson welcomed the overthrow of tyranny but watched nervously as events became more violent. The early phase of the French Revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, drawing inspiration from Enlightenment ideals and the belief that reason could create a just society. However, as the revolution progressed, it became clear that the path to a more rational and equitable France would be anything but orderly. By the early 1790s, the revolution entered a far more turbulent and violent phase, marked by political purges, public executions, and increasing centralization of power. At the center of this transformation stood Maximilien Robespierre, a figure who embodied both the ideals and contradictions of Enlightenment thought pushed to their most radical extreme. Maximilien Robespierre began his career as a lawyer and an admirer of Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Rousseau. Born in Arras in the year 1758, Robespierre was educated in Paris and became known for his eloquence, incorruptibility, and principled devotion to republican values. Early in the revolution, he gained a reputation as a fierce defender of the rights of man and an opponent of capital punishment. He spoke out against the death penalty, supported universal male suffrage, and advocated for the abolition of slavery. Yet by the year 1793, Robespierre would become one of the leading architects of the Reign of Terror, a period in which tens of thousands of people were executed in the name of the revolution. How did a man once associated with Enlightenment morality and justice come to justify mass political violence? To understand this shift, one must consider the political and social pressures gripping France at the time. The execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793 had shattered the monarchy and declared the birth of the French Republic. But the new regime was immediately beset by crises. France was at war with multiple European powers, including Austria, Prussia, and Britain. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in the provinces, and economic instability continued to cause hardship for ordinary citizens. Amid this chaos, the Jacobins, Robespierre's political faction, rose to prominence. The Jacobin Club, which began as a debating society, evolved into a powerful political force advocating for radical republicanism and central authority. In contrast to their rivals, the more moderate Girondins, the Jacobins argued that only a strong, unified government could protect the revolution from both internal and external enemies. In June of 1793, the Jacobins seized control of the National Convention, and Robespierre emerged as a key figure in the Committee of Public Safety, the body effectively tasked with governing France during the emergency. It was under this committee that the Reign of Terror began. Laws were passed to punish anyone deemed a threat to the revolution. Trials were swift, and punishments, most often the guillotine, were carried out in public squares. Robespierre and his allies justified this violence by appealing to Enlightenment principles, particularly Rousseau's concept of the general will. They argued that true liberty could not exist without virtue, and that enemies of the Republic, royalists, counter-revolutionaries, hoarders, and corrupt officials, had to be eliminated to protect the common good. In Robespierre's own words, "Terror is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue." This reasoning reflected a deep transformation in the meaning of Enlightenment ideals. The abstract concepts of liberty, equality, and reason were now being interpreted as mandates for purity and unity, rather than diversity and tolerance. Dissent was no longer a right, it was treason. Rational government had become synonymous with ideological conformity. The revolution had moved from defending rights to enforcing revolutionary virtue. The scope of the terror was vast. Between the summer of 1793 and the summer of 1794, thousands were executed in Paris alone. Across France, local tribunals sentenced many more to death. Victims included aristocrats, clergy, former revolutionaries, and ordinary citizens caught up in denunciations or political rivalries. Even former allies of Robespierre, such as Danton and Desmoulins, were sent to the guillotine when they questioned the direction of the revolution. The Enlightenment, which had emphasized individual freedom and rational debate, now found itself invoked to justify political violence and the suspension of legal norms. Revolutionary festivals replaced traditional religious ceremonies, and Robespierre himself promoted a new civic religion, the cult of the supreme being, which aimed to unite the citizenry under a shared moral code rooted in deism and virtue. In doing so, he sought to replace what he saw as the corrupting influence of Catholicism with a rational alternative. However, for many, the ceremonies appeared theatrical and forced, highlighting the growing disconnect between revolutionary ideals and public sentiment. Robespierre's downfall came as quickly as his rise. By the summer of 1794, fear and resentment were growing. Many within the convention began to see Robespierre as a tyrant, increasingly isolated and paranoid. On the 9th of Thermidor, July 27th by the Gregorian calendar, he was arrested along with his closest supporters. The following day, they were executed without trial. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the Terror and began a more moderate phase of the revolution. The legacy of the Reign of Terror is deeply complex. On the one hand, it helped preserve the Republic during a period of existential crisis. It brought a kind of revolutionary discipline that allowed France to defeat foreign invaders and suppress internal revolts. On the other hand, it stained the ideals of the revolution with blood. The use of Enlightenment principles to justify authoritarian control and political violence forced many to reconsider the limits of reason when divorced from compassion and pluralism. For Enlightenment thinkers, the Terror posed difficult questions. Could reason, when turned into dogma, become a new form of tyranny? Was the pursuit of the general will compatible with individual freedom? Could virtue be enforced by the state without becoming oppression? In the years that followed, some intellectuals sought to distance themselves from the radicalism of the Terror. Others argued that the violence was a tragic but necessary consequence of social transformation. The experience of the revolution revealed that the application of Enlightenment ideas was neither simple nor linear. Ideals could inspire great progress, but they could also be twisted by fear, ambition, and the demand for ideological purity. In the chaotic aftermath of the Reign of Terror, France found itself politically fragmented and socially exhausted. The radical phase of the revolution had left deep scars, and while the most violent excesses had subsided, the ideals of liberty and equality were now tinged with disillusionment. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. A military hero, a political opportunist, and a skilled strategist, Napoleon would end the revolution and establish himself as Emperor of the French. But he would also claim to preserve the achievements of the Enlightenment. His rule presents a compelling paradox. Was Napoleon a continuation of the Enlightenment or its betrayal? Born on the island of Corsica in the year 1769, Napoleon was a product of the revolutionary era. He had risen rapidly through the military ranks during the wars that followed the revolution, distinguishing himself in campaigns in Italy and Egypt. Unlike the old aristocratic generals, Napoleon's ascent was based on merit, a key Enlightenment principle. His promotion reflected the breakdown of the rigid class barriers that had defined the ancien regime. In 1799, Napoleon returned to France and capitalized on the political instability of the post-terror period. The government established by the Constitution of the Year 3, known as the Directory, was widely seen as ineffective and corrupt. Popular dissatisfaction with the pace of reform and ongoing wars created a power vacuum. Napoleon exploited this opportunity with a military coup known as the Coup of 18th Brumaire, in which he overthrew the Directory and established the consulate. Though nominally a republic, real power now resided with Napoleon as first consul. At first, Napoleon presented himself as the stabilizer of revolutionary France. He maintained many of the gains of the revolution, abolishing feudal privileges, upholding legal equality, and preserving religious tolerance. In many respects, he implemented Enlightenment ideals more systematically and efficiently than the revolutionary governments that had preceded him. One of Napoleon's most enduring contributions was the Napoleonic Code, introduced in the year 1804. This civil code reorganized and unified the legal system of France. It abolished aristocratic privilege, guaranteed the equality of all male citizens before the law, and upheld property rights. The Napoleonic Code also emphasized the secular nature of the state, removing church authority from legal and civil affairs. These reforms echoed the Enlightenment emphasis on rational, consistent, and universally applicable laws. Yet the Napoleonic Code also revealed the limitations of Enlightenment universalism. While it proclaimed equality in principle, it reinforced patriarchal norms. Women lost many of the rights they had gained during the Revolution. They were legally subordinated to their husbands and denied political or civil equality. In this sense, the code both advanced and restricted Enlightenment values, depending on one's social position. Napoleon also restructured the administrative apparatus of the state. He created a centralized bureaucracy based on meritocratic recruitment, expanded public education through the establishment of lycées, and introduced standardized systems of taxation and finance. These efforts reflected Enlightenment ideals of rational planning, efficiency, and the promotion of knowledge. Education, in particular, became a tool for shaping loyal and capable citizens. His concordat with the Catholic Church in the year 1801 restored relations with the papacy, which had been severed during the Revolution. While the Church regained some influence, Napoleon made it clear that the state remained supreme. The concordat reassured religious believers without returning to theocracy. It exemplified the Enlightenment strategy of managing religion through pragmatic negotiation rather than persecution or fanaticism. However, Napoleon's rule also exposed the darker possibilities of Enlightenment governance. As his power grew, so did his ambition. In the year 1804, he crowned himself emperor, marking a clear break from the republican spirit of the Revolution. Although he claimed that his authority derived from the people and was confirmed through plebiscites, the reality was increasingly autocratic. The ideals of popular sovereignty and civic participation were subordinated to centralized authority and imperial ambition. Censorship returned under Napoleon's regime. While Enlightenment thinkers had celebrated the free exchange of ideas, Napoleon tightly controlled the press, suppressed dissent, and limited public debate. The educational system, though expanded, became a means of promoting loyalty to the state rather than encouraging critical thought. Secret police monitored political opponents, and critics were imprisoned or exiled. Freedom of expression, a hallmark of the Enlightenment, was sacrificed for the sake of order and national unity. Internationally, Napoleon presented himself as the liberator of Europe, spreading the values of the Revolution: equality before the law, abolition of feudalism, and rational administration, to the territories he conquered. In Italy, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe, his armies dismantled old regimes and introduced reforms modeled on French institutions. In many places, local populations welcomed these changes, at least initially. Yet, Napoleon's conquests also brought exploitation, conscription, and imperial domination. His empire was built not on mutual consent, but on military might. Resistance grew, especially in Spain, Prussia, and Russia, where national identities and religious traditions clashed with the secular, bureaucratic model imposed by France. The universalism of the Enlightenment became, in practice, a form of cultural imperialism. The contradiction between Enlightenment ideals and imperial reality became increasingly apparent. Napoleon, who once championed merit and reason, relied on dynastic appointments, censorship, and constant warfare to maintain control. His defeat at the Battle of Leipzig and eventual exile to Elba marked the beginning of the end. When he returned briefly in the 100 Days and was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815, his fall closed a turbulent chapter in French and European history. The legacy of Napoleon's reign remains complex. On one hand, he preserved and institutionalized many Enlightenment reforms. The Napoleonic Code would serve as a legal foundation not only in France but in many other countries. His administrative, educational, and economic reforms laid the groundwork for the modern nation-state. On the other hand, his authoritarianism, censorship, and militarism betrayed the Enlightenment's more humanistic and democratic aspirations. For some, Napoleon was a necessary response to revolutionary chaos, a leader who gave form to Enlightenment principles when revolutionary idealism had spiraled into violence. For others, he was a tyrant who used Enlightenment rhetoric to mask ambition and domination. His reign revealed the tension between order and liberty, between reform and control, that would continue to shape political thought for generations. As the Enlightenment came to an end with the Napoleonic era, its ideas did not disappear. They had been institutionalized, contested, and transformed, but they remained alive. The revolution and empire had demonstrated the power of ideas to change the world, but also the dangers of dogma, even when cloaked in reason. The French Enlightenment, a complex and far-reaching intellectual movement that began in the early 18th century, did not end with the fall of the Bastille or the rise of Napoleon. While its most dramatic moments unfolded in the salons of Paris, the chambers of revolutionary assemblies, and on battlefields across Europe, its legacy extended far beyond the borders of France and long beyond the lives of its original thinkers. It reshaped political institutions, transformed educational models, challenged religious authority, and redefined the relationship between individuals and society. In doing so, it laid many of the foundations for the modern world. One of the most enduring contributions of the French Enlightenment was its emphasis on reason as a guiding principle in human affairs. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Condorcet argued that human beings, through rational inquiry and critical thinking, could understand the world and improve it. This belief was not simply a philosophical stance. It became a practical method applied to science, politics, education, law, and ethics. The idea that reason could challenge superstition, overturn tyranny, and advance knowledge inspired generations of reformers and revolutionaries. This commitment to reason helped birth the modern scientific worldview. French Enlightenment thinkers did not all work in laboratories, but they promoted a culture that valued empirical evidence, systematic observation, and skepticism toward inherited dogma. Figures like Buffon, D'Alembert, and the contributors to the Encyclopedie helped bring scientific knowledge to a broader public and argued that science was a collective, cumulative effort. Their influence is evident today in the structures of public education, the popularization of science, and the continued belief in progress through research and innovation. In the realm of politics, the Enlightenment's legacy is perhaps most visible. The French Enlightenment did not invent democracy, but it articulated many of the principles that underpin modern democratic institutions. Montesquieu's theory of the separation of powers, Rousseau's notion of the general will, and Voltaire's defense of civil liberties all contributed to a new vision of political legitimacy based on the consent of the governed and the protection of individual rights. These ideas informed not only the French and American revolutions, but also later movements for constitutionalism, human rights, and representative government across Europe and beyond. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted during the early phase of the French Revolution, distilled many of these Enlightenment principles into a concise political manifesto. Its assertions that all men are born free and equal, that sovereignty resides in the nation, and that law must apply equally to all, remain foundational to modern legal and political systems. Its influence can be traced in later declarations of rights, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in the mid-20th century. Equally important was the Enlightenment's challenge to religious authority. The French philosophes were not all atheists, but they shared a suspicion of institutional religion's role in perpetuating ignorance and oppression. They promoted religious tolerance, freedom of conscience, and a secular understanding of morality. Their work helped to dislodge the Church from its privileged position in French society and contributed to the broader trend of secularization in the modern West. This shift did not mean the end of religion, but it changed the terms on which it operated. Enlightenment thinkers argued that belief should be a private matter and that no institution should have the power to dictate faith or suppress dissent. This principle of secular governance has since become a cornerstone of liberal democracies, enshrining freedom of religion while preventing religious domination of public life. The Enlightenment also left its mark on education. Diderot and Condorcet, among others, argued for universal public instruction grounded in reason, science, and moral development. They believed that education was not only a right, but a means of cultivating responsible citizens capable of self-government. Their advocacy laid the groundwork for modern public schooling systems, which aim to provide broad access to knowledge and foster civic engagement. However, the legacy of the French Enlightenment is not without its limitations and contradictions. Many Enlightenment thinkers spoke in universal terms, but their vision often excluded women, the poor, and colonial subjects. While they championed liberty and equality, these ideals were not always applied consistently. Women like Olympe de Gouges, who demanded equal rights during the Revolution, were marginalized or punished for stepping outside traditional roles. Slavery persisted in French colonies despite growing abolitionist sentiment, revealing the gap between Enlightenment ideals and colonial reality. These tensions have become the subject of renewed reflection in modern times. Scholars and activists have revisited Enlightenment texts to explore both their emancipatory potential and their blind spots. Feminist theorists have critiqued the exclusion of women from the public sphere envisioned by many philosophes. Post-colonial thinkers have interrogated how Enlightenment rhetoric was sometimes used to justify imperialism. These critiques do not reject the Enlightenment, but rather call for its expansion, to include all voices and to fulfill its promises more fully. It is also important to recognize that the French Enlightenment was not a single, unified movement. It was a constellation of overlapping ideas, arguments, and perspectives. Voltaire's satire, Rousseau's moral idealism, Diderot's encyclopedic ambition, and Montesquieu's political analysis all represented different strands of thought. The strength of the Enlightenment lay in its diversity, its willingness to debate, and its openness to revision. It was, in many ways, an intellectual marketplace where ideas competed, evolved, and sometimes contradicted one another. This openness to dialogue remains one of the Enlightenment's most vital legacies. In an era marked by polarized debate and ideological rigidity, the Enlightenment model of reasoned argument, evidence-based inquiry, and civil disagreement offers a valuable framework. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line, but a conversation, one that requires humility, curiosity, and respect for complexity. Finally, the Enlightenment's greatest gift may be its enduring question: how should we live together? It asked not only how power should be distributed or knowledge pursued, but how humans should treat one another, how societies should be organized, and what it means to be free. These questions are no less relevant today than they were in the 18th century. Whether in debates about democracy, education, science, or human rights, the spirit of the French Enlightenment continues to shape our world. The Enlightenment did not end with a revolution or an empire. It lives on in institutions, debates, and aspirations. Its thinkers are long gone, but its questions remain with us, in every courtroom that weighs justice against power, in every school that teaches the value of inquiry, and in every citizen who demands dignity, equality, and truth. This concludes the story of the French Enlightenment, not as a finished chapter of history, but as an ongoing legacy that continues to challenge, inspire, and provoke.